Director Robert Alvarez has spent most of his working life in animation. If there's a job in the cartoon business, he says, he has spent part of his career doing it. Everything from painting backgrounds to drawing storyboards to writing and pitching shows. One of his first jobs, working on an animated feature called Yellow Submarine, and he's worked on hundreds of projects since. Robert talked to us at Cartoon Network in Burbank, California. We're speaking to Robert Alvarez, one of the longtime pillars of Hanna-Barbera, and we're going to, back in the day, and now at Cartoon Network. He's done everything and worked everywhere, and we're going to talk to him. So, Robert, we've known each other a while. How did you get started in the business? Because you and your friend Tim Walker sort of came in at the same time.
It's actually kind of interesting. I'll do a little backtrack. I met Tim in the 7th grade at St. Charles School in North Hollywood. And we became fast friends because we both liked the same thing. We liked comic books, cartoons, comic strips. And Tim brought to school one day some original cells from the Flintstones. He used to live next door to this executive that worked at ABC, and so occasionally the executive guy would get him stuff. And he brought these cells in, and I went, wow, this is great. I'd never seen animation cells before. So we became good friends, and we used to ride our bikes after school a lot to Hanna-Barbera, UPA, Format Films, any place that was in the valley that we knew that existed. And we'd jump into the trash cans. And whatever we could find, we would take. Drawing cells, whatever.
Do you still have any of those?
I do. I have some stuff that I pulled out of the trash cans from UPA. I have some stuff from... I wish I had all the stuff that we took from Hanna-Barbera's trash cans, but that's long gone. But I still have some of it. And I have some drawings and stuff that I got from Format. And on occasion, my dad would drive us on a Saturday down to Hanna-Barbera, or one time he took us to Clampett Studio on a Saturday, and we jumped into the trash can. And I still have drawings from that trip.
And in those days, everybody was throwing stuff in a dumpster.
Yeah, everything was thrown away. Nobody wanted the stuff except kids like myself and Tim. And eventually, more kids, somehow, I don't know, if they found out about this, and you would start seeing on Saturdays, like, other kids showing up on their bikes or somebody. But for the most part, it was just Tim and myself riding our bikes to these studios, and we did it quite frequently.
With backpacks.
With the old army style backpacks. This predates what backpacks are like now. You were like knapsacks, like from Boy Scouts or Army things, and we used to do it all the time.
Stuff them.
Yeah, and so that I think started my interest a lot in animation, and Tim and I would do our own home movies. Making our own cartoons. We made a few, and we're both interested and wanted to do this. I still remember this story that one day I was standing in line, and it was 8th grade, and at St. Charles, anyone who went to Catholic school in the 50s or 60s can relate to this. It was kind of like going to prison, except you got to go home at the end of the day. You would line them up. All the classes would line up so they could march you in. And you would march out at the end of the day, and you had to wear uniforms. Now that I think of it, it was prison. So I'm standing in line, and there's other kids standing next to me, and I'm talking about some cartoon show that I watched and I really liked. And we're in, I think it was 8th grade, and he said to me, "You still watch cartoons?" I go, "Yeah." And it kind of really pissed me off that he would say that to me. So yeah, and someday I'm going to be an animator. I had no idea how that would ever happen. But that's what I wanted to do. And eventually it did happen. And how I got started was, I was in art school at the time.
Now, where did you go to art school?
I went to Chenard, the old Chenard Art School downtown. And interesting enough, Tim Walker was in the class with me, Dale Baer, Mark Kausler, and I think that's the only ones. Larry Huber was in a grade ahead of me, and he graduated before me.
All guys that ended up having long, lucrative careers.
Right. And the funny thing is, like, Dale Baer was an interesting guy because I don't remember ever hearing him say 2 words the entire time I saw him in school. And he eventually became this great animator. Who knew?
He's still a directing animator over at Disney Feature
He's
Animation.
a super talent. And Mark Kalzer was a great animator before he ever even got to the school. He had been doing his own films back in Kansas City, and he was just a super talent. Anyway, so I went to Chenard. And while I was at Chenard, I think it was actually my first year, one of the guys that was in the film department with me, I had gone to high school with. And he got a job at Fred Calvert's studio. And it was a small place in North Hollywood. And he called me up one night, and it was in the summertime. And he said, "Do you still want to get into animation?" I said, "Absolutely." So he said, "Come on over to this studio," and it was only like 10 minutes from my house, "and meet Fred Calvert, and maybe you can get a job here." So I went over there. It was at nighttime, and Fred showed me how to do it in between. I already had knowledge of animation on that, but I'd never done anything professionally. And they were doing at the time subcontract work for Hanna-Barbera on the cartoons that were on the Banana Split show. They were doing work on Three Musketeers and Arabian Nights.
So what year was it?
This was 1968.
1968.
Yeah, that was the year I started. So he showed me how to do an in-between, and then he sat me down in a room at a desk with some paper and two extremes, and he said, "Okay, now you try." And he came back in a half hour and checked my drawing out, and he said, "Okay, you can start tomorrow." And I said, "Great." I went home, I was all excited, and that was one of the few nights that I've ever dreamt about animation. Because the entire night, I had nightmares. Like, I just kept seeing drawings moving and moving and moving because I was so worked up and excited. And I started the next day. And the interesting thing about it was, he told me, he said, "We'll pay you $50 a week as soon as we start using your drawings in production." Now I was, you can see what's coming up next. I was so excited. I'm in the industry. I would have done anything, and I took the job. And as it turns out, they used however bad the drawings might have been, they were using my stuff from day one. But I didn't get paid for about the first month with the excuse like, "Well, it wasn't good enough." He only got embarrassed.
Using it.
Yeah, he got embarrassed into paying me because some other young guy came in who was really good. He came in from Korea and was just kind of like blowing through town and eventually going to leave. And he started paying him right away. And I think he got embarrassed that I had been there for a month and hadn't been paid. So I started getting
So
paid.
you worked for Fred Calvert for free for a month.
And my first paycheck, which I meant to bring to show you, I have a copy of it. I keep it in my drawer. Was
you never cashed it?
No. I have a Xerox copy.
Oh, you have a
of it.
Xerox copy.
And it's so the Xerox is so faded. It looks like an original check. It's dated from July of 1968, and my take-home pay was $39 and some change, which is like not a lot of money. But I was excited. I finally was in the business that I wanted to get into, and that was my stepping stone. I'm grateful to Fred for giving me that first job, although it didn't take me too long to figure out this guy wasn't exactly honest, because I realized I should have been I eventually found out, wait a minute.
But he had you work for free.
I was working for free.
So.
It didn't matter because I'll tell you what, the opportunity was great. It led me into meeting other people. While I was there, I also got to work on Yellow Sub because Dwayne Crowler, who was an animator who was renting space in the building, got subcontracted work from England to do Yellow Sub. And Dwayne...
So you worked on the Beatles' Yellow Submarine.
Yeah, which was great because I'm a big Beatle fan, and at the time I'm going, this is fantastic. I'm working on a Beatle film. And Dwayne was the type of guy that would wait to the last minute to do whatever he had to do. And he was a fantastic animator. He did a lot of commercial work. He had done work at UPA, and he was just really a good guy. He eventually went on to be one of the co-founders of Duck Soup Productions and all that. So he waited to the last minute, which meant that everything that the assistant work was done at the last minute. So everybody that was in the place at the time, even though we were working on Hanna-Barbera stuff, had to jump on to help him out to finish up his sequences, whatever. So I got to work on Yellow Sub.
So you've got drawings in the Yellow Submarine?
Somewhere, yeah. I have drawings at home from Yellow Submarine because I kept a lot of his roughs and layout stuff that he threw away. And
what stuff did he work on for that?
It was the Bloomini stuff at the end with the splotching sequence where the roses start popping up or the flowers popping up on it. There's a lot of that stuff. And Ron Campbell was also there, and he was doing some animation too on some of the sequence. I think he animated on some of the nowhere man stuff. But my memory mostly of that is the Blue Meanie stuff.
So how many minutes or how much footage did Dwayne do of?
I don't know. I don't
Probably
remember.
10 minutes,
I don't
5
remember
minutes.
because I don't remember how. I just remember being excited that I got to work on it, and I don't remember how much time I spent on, because we're talking now 42, almost 43 years ago, so I don't remember exactly.
But that was probably about the only feature outside of Disney that's had resonance from that period of time.
Yeah. I think I still like the feature. I think it has a great look. It's really interesting. And
It was really the un-Disney animated feature of its
Yeah.
time, and I think that's great.
Yeah, I liked it. So that was the opportunity. And working for Fred gave me the opportunity to meet other people that eventually got to know better, because being around there was Norm Gottfredson was there, super talented. Norm had worked on a lot of the Roger Ramjet stuff, and he was there. And I already mentioned Ron Campbell, who I got to know, and Dwayne Crowler, and that's where I met Al Wilsbach, and eventually guys like being around there. Because I came back to that building later on in the 80s and rented the space myself, long after Fred was gone and sold his interest in the property. And I rented the space, and then Lee Mishkin was there, and Sam Nicholson, and a bunch of other guys. So I got to know a lot of people just being there. But it was a great
So
opportunity.
how long were you working for Fred that
I
first
worked.
gig?
What I did was I would work for him during the season, like the summer season, and work for him, and then go back to school in the fall. And then when the season would start up, I would start working for him again. So I worked for him for the first 2 seasons of my career there, and then I went and started working for Tony Love, Bill Hutton, and Ed Love when they first started their company, and they were doing work on the Harlem Globetrotter show, the first one for Hanna-Barbera. So I worked for them for several years, and then it was eventually, it was a thing of like working for subcontractors and a lot of other people in town, and I did return doing a lot of work for Tony and Bill over the years until probably into the early 80s. I was still doing work for them quite extensively, and then eventually that led me into working for Hanna-Barbera directly.
Now, describe, because you did feature work, but you did a lot of television work.
I did. My feature work is very, very minimal, and most of I was doing in
But you've done
betweens.
direct-to-video features, and you've done...
Well, no. Here's what I did. My feature work is very, very limited. I never had a desire to be in features. It just happened on a few occasions, and I wouldn't say any of the Yellow Submarine was good and it was a fun experience, but my other feature work was very, very limited in the sense that it was like in the 90s I animated on the Jetson feature, which is, I don't particularly think it's a good feature, and I did work on, God, what was it? I was just thinking of it the other day, another feature. It'll probably come to me in a minute. Oh yeah, another terrible feature was the Filmation feature, Pinocchio, Emperor of the Night.
Pinocchio and the Emperor of the Night, that was sort of in the last flowering of Filmation.
Yeah, that's a real piece of shit. But I worked on that, and that because I needed the work at the time, and it was an opportunity. I had been working for Filmation, and one of the directors there said to me, like, well, go over and report over there, and you can start picking up some work. And so it was just something to do.
Now, you were an animator for the first 10 or 15 years of your career, pretty much, weren't you?
I started out as an in-betweener and worked my way up. And over the course of my career, starting out as an in-betweener, I've done everything except load the film in the camera and shoot the work. I've done in-betweening to assistant work to animation, layout, storyboard. I've done backgrounds, character design. I've done a lot of stuff over the years, and it was just being in the right place at the right time that allowed me to do different jobs.
But in the early part, like in the 70s and 80s, when there was a lot of animation work,
Right.
where you were doing the animation for television because the work was here.
Right.
And then, of course, a lot of it migrated out, some of it's migrated back. But so, as I looked at all of your credits this morning, you have a lot of, you were animation director in the 90s and in this century. But if you go back and, Robert Alvarez, animator. So you were animating on a lot of the stuff when it was still here in the country being animated.
Right.
And would
Yeah.
would you say that was the first, 10 or 15 years you were,
Yeah.
you were doing designing and you were doing storyboard work?
I didn't start doing directing work until around 1985. And that started out by writing X sheets, which it went into slugging boards, and then doing both. But yeah, for the first part of my career, it was starting out doing assistant work, then into animation, and occasionally doing layout and storyboards.
You were bent over that light board.
Oh yeah, in the early days, I remember this. In fact, I remember once taking work home on a weekend when I was doing work for Tony Love and Bill Hutton. I don't remember the show, but I remember I was doing work on a weekend, and I had started early on a Sunday morning, and I was working all the way through the day into the night, and it was like, I don't know, 4 o'clock in the morning, and I was going to have to go into work into the studio around 8 or 9. But the drawings started moving without me helping them. I was so punch drunk that I went, oh, this is not good. And I put the pencil down and went to sleep for a couple hours and then got up and went to work. But yeah, in the old days, I think the one thing I got out of my Catholic high school education, which was almost like another prison sentence, was discipline.
Sitting in that chair.
Yes, because when I was I went to Notre Dame High School, and they worked you to death. They're giving you constant work. So that set up some kind of a discipline thing with me, where when it came to work in animation, I would get up early, sit down at the desk, and I still do this to this day. I would sit down at the desk, and I would work all day. In my younger days, I would work from at least by 9 o'clock in the morning until sometimes midnight at night, and go to sleep, get up the next day and do the same thing, and I would do it 7 days a week. I don't do it now because it takes too much out of you. So I still get up early now for other reasons, but I'm usually here at work at 6:30 in the morning, and I leave at 4, and then I go home and work for several more hours at home.
Now, are you juggling today? We're going to jump ahead to today.
Okay.
Because now you're a lead director here at Cartoon Network, and you've been kind of with the studio from the beginning, right? You sort of segued over from Hanna-Barbera.
Right. The interesting thing is, I was thinking about this today before you got here, but people think that Cartoon Network started when we moved into this building, which was 10 years ago, but that's not really true. Cartoon Network actually started when Turner bought us. When we were at Hanna-Barbera, Turner bought Hanna-Barbera. And already early on during that time, and that was in the mid-90s, the Cartoon Network thing started up. That's when the cable station started up, and he put on all of the Hanna-Barbera programming and MGM stuff and whatever he had the rights to. But we could already see coming in at Hanna-Barbera the logo and the talk of changing the studio name from Hanna-Barbera to Cartoon Network, which in those days there were still people there that were the old timers. There was still a number of them around.
Been there since Bill and Joe
a lot of them had
got
been
out
around
of the
for a long
garage.
time. Yeah, they'd been around for a long time, and they resented anything that sounded like a name change, and they were resistant to a lot of what Turner was doing at the time. And at first, my thought was, when they came in and I met Fred Seibert, I thought, oh, this is rather strange, because the whole system's being overturned, and it was no longer going to be the way it was, and I thought it was going to be a bad thing. It actually turned out to be a good thing, because Fred did things that were completely different the way it was done before, and I really think he did a lot of really good things at the studio. One of which was getting artists to come up with concepts and create shows that were artist-driven. They were no longer the way the old days were, a room full of writers, and maybe the head of the studio would go oh, let's come up with some ideas and go pitch to the network. It was no longer that way.
Well,
And-
didn't Fred sort of propel Hanna-Barbera into the Cartoon Network era?
Right.
And develop a lot of shows that became sort of the core of
Yeah.
Cartoon Network programming?
What Fred did, and what he did was, and what was actually good was the fact that, and it's still done to this day, but I think everybody else kind of mimicked him. I mean, he brought the same process to Nickelodeon eventually. He introduced this program of doing shorts, which were all could be potential pilots. And if you had an idea for a short, you would go talk about your idea, and if you thought it was worthwhile, you would go do a storyboard, and then you would book a date for when the executives from the Cartoon Network were going to be in town. And it was basically you would go in and pitch your storyboard, and they would take your storyboard and blow up the storyboard to a rather large size, and they would paste it down on foam core boards. And this is all before digital pitching.
Right.
Today, you do it digital, and it saves you a lot of paper and time and space. But this was the day before digital.
We're talking the early 90s here.
This is
right?
in starting around 94, 95, somewhere around there. And you would pitch your story to them, and if they liked the idea, you get a green light, and then from there you were in the process of doing a 7-minute short, and you had a budget to do the 7-minute short. And when the short was done, who knew? But maybe it might be a potential series that they would launch. That's where Johnny Bravo came from, Cow and Chicken, Powerpuff Girls, Dexter's Lab. I think those were the original ones that came out of that first series of shorts. And I think it turned out to be a great idea. And what it afforded people like myself was I got the opportunity to work with new people, different people. I did a lot of work with Pat Ventura. I worked on all of his shorts, and then he eventually did work for me on one of my shorts. And I got to work again with Mark Kauser, who I had first met in art school, and it was great because we were doing stuff that wasn't driven by some guy that had been around for the last 50 years and just doing the same formula over and over again. I think Hanna-Barbera had stagnated in the 70s and 80s into doing stuff that wasn't all that great.
The repeats of the stuff
Yeah,
that they had
you know,
done earlier.
Yeah, and
Scooby-Doo is with us to this day.
well, I tell people like Scooby-Doo is like a vampire. You can't kill it. It's going to be around forever.
Oh yeah, well, it's because people keep watching it.
Long after you and I are both off the planet, they'll still be doing Scooby-Doo somewhere.
We're producing it and making new episodes.
Yeah.
It'll go on. Who would have thought that was
It's
the heirloom
funny.
of Hanna-Barbera?
I think I don't understand it, quite honestly. I've never liked Scooby. Working on some of the Scooby shows.
Now, you've worked on quite a number of them.
Yeah, I worked on Scooby, not the original Scooby, because that was done in '67, which the first ones, the year before I started. So by the time I got into the business, they weren't really doing Scooby. But then eventually did Scooby in the '70s, sometime in the '70s and '80s. And so I worked on some of those, and I never liked it. I never liked the characters. I didn't like Scooby. I especially didn't like the little dog Scrappy. And worked on.
But you worked on it nevertheless.
Well, here's the way it is. And some people will say like, sometimes you hear like the criticism like, well, how come you worked on that or this, whatever, and they don't think it was a good show. That's not how it works. You work on what's available, what you can get a job on. If you work on something that turns out to be really good and you liked it, great, but it doesn't always work that way. I used to tell students that would come through on tours at Hanna-Barbera, I would say to them, 9 times out of 10, no, 10 times out of 9, you're going to work on something you don't like, but it's the nature of the business. You don't always get to work on the best stuff. You don't always get to work on stuff that turns out to be something fantastic or great. But if you want to stay in the business and you want to keep going, the process of work requires you to work on what is available. If you only worked on something you like, only really great stuff, you probably would be very poor. You probably would have a tough time existing.
Years and years ago, Edward Herman, an actor, I interviewed him for a publicity kit at Disney, and he said he had done a film with Laurence Olivier. And he said to Olivier, God, what a great career you've had. You planned it, you did this. And Olivier said, I didn't plan anything. He said, I finished a job, and I looked around to see, well, what's available? What can I do? What's out there that I can jump onto. And he said, this wasn't thought out. This wasn't planned. This career arc that you think you see, it wasn't there. And I think that's the way for a lot of, animation people, it's the same thing in spades.
I think for people, especially for people that are my age, that started out when I started, in television animation, it may have been different in features, but in television animation, you worked on what was available, what you would get hired on to, wherever you could go. And sometimes it was good, and sometimes it was bad. Now, I've worked in places where I thought was fun and that I enjoyed a lot, and the people were great. And I've also worked in a few places that I don't particularly like. I didn't like at the time, and I couldn't wait to get out of there. There was one place I worked that after a week, I said, I'm out of here. I quit.
What was the studio? Do you remember?
Marvel.
Oh, Marvel.
And it was because I was working there, and this was in the 1980s, and it was probably before. I think it was before 1985, but. I went to work there because my friends Tim Walker and Jeff Hall had got jobs there, and I thought it was going to be a step up into getting into directing, because that was the whole purpose of me going to work over there. And I had been an animator at Hanna-Barbera, and his name escapes me now. Who was running the? He was in charge of the directors. I can still see his. Oh, John Gibbs. That's who. Yeah, John Gibbs was in charge of the directors. He wasn't a nice man. Let's put it that way. He liked lording over the monkeys. He would sit in his room and lean back in his desk, and all of us were working in this bullpen area with desks that looked like they were used in the movie The Apartment with Jack Lemmon.
Oh yeah, I
desks.
remember that.
That's what it looked like, except not as many. But we were all sitting at these desks, no phones. You would sit there, and if you had nothing to do, you had to like fake it like you had something to do, and you'd be staring.
Look busy.
Yeah, and you didn't want to make eye contact with him because that meant you weren't working. Because he would lean back in his desk and look out at you, and it was so terrible, and just the working atmosphere. And I remember being there for like 3 days and not really doing anything. He said, practice, like make something up. I'm like, what? And then I got put on to doing some retakes on. They were doing a potential pilot or something that for Where the Wild Things Go, or whatever that.
Wild Things Are Where the Wild Things Are.
Yeah, Maurice Sendak thing. Someone had done some, and I was fixing up someone's animation, and I'm going, I didn't come over here to do this. So at the end of the week, Tim and Jeff were going to be leaving because they'd been there for a while, because they had got a call from Hanna-Barbera, and they were going to have contracts to go back to work at Hanna-Barbera. And I thought, I don't want to stay here. My friends are leaving. This place sucks. I went into, it was on a Friday afternoon. I went in. I made a smart move. I called up Jay Sabri, who was the head of animation back in Hanna-Barbera, and said, can I have my job back? And he said, sure. And so I went into Gibbs' office and I said, I'm not happy. I'm going to leave. I want to leave. And he got really pissed off at me, and he started yelling at me. And I said, I can stay, another week or two if you need to replace. He said, no, get the hell out. So at the end of the day, at 5 o'clock, I went out the door and I never felt so good. And I bumped into him at one of the Animation Guild
Golden Awards.
It was I think it was the first one that they had.
It's Sorrentino's in Toluca Lake.
No, I think it was up at the Starlight. I don't remember.
Probably the Castaways.
Yeah, I think it was up there. Anyways, I bumped into him and I thought, I'm just gonna be nice and go up and say hello to him. And the first thing out of his mouth was, "So did you get your contract?" And I said, "No, I didn't leave because I didn't like. I left because I didn't like the place. I didn't like working there." And he was pissed. I think he was pissed at me to the day he died. Which is another interesting story. When I bumped into Rudy Cataldi on an elevator. I was picking up freelance at Marvel, and Rudy said, "Hey, did you hear what happened to your friend John Gibbs?" And I said, "No." And he goes, "Oh, he dropped dead." And in Jim, he was like, and I said, "Yeah, you're kidding." I thought Rudy was just saying that because he knew the history of it. And he said, "No, it's true. He dropped dead."
There is a God.
Yeah,
We continue now with part 2 of the Robert Alvarez interview.
Because I left because I didn't like the place. I didn't like working there, and he was pissed. I think he was pissed at me to the day he died.
A man that held his
which is
grudge.
another interesting story. When I bumped into Rudy Cataldi on an elevator. I was picking up freelance at Marvel, and Rudy said, "Hey, did you hear what happened to your friend John Gibbs?" And I said, "No," and he goes, "Oh, he dropped dead." And Jim, he's like, and I said, "Yeah, you're kidding." I thought Rudy was just saying that because he knew the history of it. And he said, "No, it's true. He dropped dead."
There is a God.
Yeah, I mean, Gibbs was not, look, I don't wish harm on anybody, but Gibbs was not a pleasant man.
Well, I've encountered people like that in my capacity and before.
I'll tell you another Gibbs story. This is kind of interesting. We had a meeting up in Lee Gunther's office because people were getting...
and this was at Marvel.
At Marvel.
Lee Gunther was
Yeah.
running Marvel.
Yeah. Everyone was getting concerned because they started sending work to Japan to be fully direct over there. Like, I think it was the Transformers. So people, wait a minute, what's happening? We're going to be laid off, and everyone's getting crazed. And so he calls all the directors up to his office, and Gibbs is standing next to him like the loyal lieutenant he was. And Lee's telling us the old story that you would hear many times, and he'd say, "Don't worry about nothing, boys, because nothing's going to be all right." And he's telling you, like, everything's going to be great. You're going to be working right through December and blah, 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 blah. So 15, 20 minutes later, I'm downstairs back in the bullpen, standing next to my crummy desk that looked like it had been recycled from the former Soviet Union. And Gibbs comes up to me and he says, "So what'd you think of that meeting?" And I looked at him and I said, "Well, didn't mean anything to me. I've been in meetings like that before. It was no big deal." He got really pissed off at me and he goes, "Well, I've worked for this company for 20 years. Now, mind you, Marvel hadn't been around for 20 years. He was including his work with DePatie Freeling, Warner Brothers DePatie Freeling. He goes, "I've worked for this company for 20 years and I've got my house, I've got my boat, and I've got my Porsche." And I'm looking at him thinking, like, I've been here less than 1 week. What does that mean to me? Big deal. He just was, he wasn't a pleasant man.
Yeah, there's... Ken Anderson is in my pantheon of...
Yeah, I know.
people
You've
who
told
are
me the stories
unpleasant.
of Ken Anderson.
But here's a question I have. I want to talk about Hanna-Barbera.
Okay.
Because you worked at Hanna-Barbera for a good long while.
Right.
And when we walked down the hall, you were telling me about one of your interactions with... you didn't have a lot of interactions with...
Well, this...
Bill
Oh, yeah, I know.
Joe,
You're getting to the Bill Hanna
I'm getting
story.
to the Bill Hanna story about...
This is not my interaction. This is a story that was told to me way back when by a guy that used to work in editing at Hanna-Barbera. And I've told this story to many people because it's really kind of a funny story, but it's a true story. There was this guy sitting, and this is when editing used to be in the main building, the 3400.
Down on Cahuenga.
Yeah, and the basement. The editing was downstairs. A guy in editing sitting in the editing, one of the editing rooms, and he's got his feet up on the desk and he's staring at his time card, but he's talking out loud to himself, talking about what am I going to put down on this time? What should I put down on my time card? What he didn't realize was standing in the doorway at the time while he's talking to himself was Bill Hanna. Bill Hanna's listening to everything he's saying, and so he goes, "Wow, what should I put down on my time card?" Bill Hanna said, "Why don't you put down 40 hours of fucking off?" That was Bill Hanna. He could be really rough and he could be tough, and that was typical. I once, when we were doing Smurfs, got called to a meeting. All the animators got called to a meeting by Bill Hanna, and we had to wait for him to show up. He shows up a little bit late for the meeting after lunch. We're all sitting in this conference room, and he starts basically yelling at us for doing too much work. This is funny now.
Too much work?
Too much work. His theory was, in those days, you were supposed to do 60 feet of animation to justify your salary. So you should be doing at least 60 feet of animation, but he wasn't going to
In what time period?
This is the
60 feet.
1980s.
Yeah, but you were 60 feet
Oh,
per
a
week.
week. A week.
60 feet of animation a
TV
week.
animation.
So you were pencil to the paper.
Right. But you were not, they had a bonus system there where they would allow you to pick up some extra footage. But he wasn't going to pay you for more than 10 feet of bonus work at a footage rate. Because he figured if you were doing more work than that, you were just crapping it out. And it wasn't going to be any good. And he was really pissed off at us and yelling at us. And the only one that really stood up to him at the time that questioned him at all was Rudy Cataldi. which I always thought was amazing because Cataldi's attitude was like he wasn't going to take shit from anybody. And then again,
then and now, he's not any different now.
I really admire Rudy Cataldi. Hanna had his loyal lieutenant at the time, Jay Sabri, standing next to him, and you could almost hear Sabri's heels click as he would, as Hanna would say stuff. And it was really kind of a funny meeting. He was upset with us for doing too much work, which is kind of funny because you think of all the subcontract work that was being done in town at the same time. You could go anywhere in town and pick up work from one of the subcontractors, and you could be doing a lot more than he wanted you to do, and there was nothing he could do about it.
And some of the time, he probably wouldn't even have known.
There's no way he would know, and everybody was doing it. There was always the guys that were never going to meet the quota because they were just slow and lazy, and God knows what they were doing. And there was guys that would hustle and do as much as they could because, as we all knew in those days, you would work when there was work, and then sometimes you'd be laid off for 6 months.
And it was seasonal, right?
It was seasonal. When I first started in the business, you'd work about 6 months, and then you'd be laid off for 6 months.
So everybody learned to save their money and live on.
Well, yeah, you would collect unemployment, and then in those days, unemployment was different from what it was now. You would have to go to the unemployment office, stand on line, and wait for your time to come up. Then you go to another window to get cash. They didn't give you checks; it was cash, and always the highest denominations possible. And my feeling was like whenever you went to, I always felt this way when you'd go to a grocery store afterwards, and you had like a $50 bill. My feeling was, and this is stupid on my part, but they must know I'm on unemployment. I have a $50 bill. How embarrassing! So
quick, run to the bank and get it broken down.
It was tough, and because you had to wait online. And I never liked it, but it was different. So in those days it was seasonal work. So you try to work as much as you could, and then when you weren't working, if you were lucky, you might get work on a commercial or some film somewhere else. But for the most part, you didn't work during that time until years later things started changing and the
whole distribution system changed.
Yeah, everything changed, and it's not like that now. But that's the way when I learned, that's the way the system was.
And that was from the late '60s straight through into the '80s, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's still in the '80s. And then late '80s things started changing, and once the studios were no longer pitching to the networks, and it was the big corporations owning the studios, things eventually changed. Especially when Turner came in and bought Hanna-Barbera, there was a big change.
Now, when Turner came in, and because Hanna-Barbera had been owned by Hearst, and they'd been owned by
they were owned by several companies before Turner bought them.
Right, but when Turner bought them, and Fred came in. Talk about that because I've had a lot of really positive experiences with Fred and his own company. And
well, when they first came in,
we're talking about Fred Siebert.
Yeah, when they first came in, and Fred made the rounds of the studio and introducing himself, and he made a point to make meetings with the different departments and different people, and everybody got to know him. It was interesting. Of course, I didn't know what it was like. And at first, I was kind of afraid of Turner taking over because I thought this might potentially be a bad thing. And I already mentioned this before. What they did was they changed the system. It was no longer like departments where one department did everything. Some of them remained the same, but it was no longer the same. And he started changing things around, and he introduced a lot of young talent into the studio, and that's when we started doing the shorts as potential pilots, and it became actually a really great place. I really liked it after a while. I thought it was really great. I'm sorry that they ever merged with Time Warner, because that was a big change. We moved off the lot and went up to Sherman Oaks, and I didn't particularly like the stay at Sherman Oaks facility, and I'm happy that there was that split between the forces when we were in Sherman Oaks and eventually came over here.
Yeah, and they moved to Burbank from Sherman Oaks. All I remember about that, a lot of that period, was they were redoing the Sherman Oaks Galleria, and it was dust, and loud noises endlessly over there. It was
Well, yeah, when I was
terrible to work there.
When I was out there, I worked in the Imperial Bank building, and what was left of Hanna-Barbera was on the 14th floor, with the exception of the unit that was doing Powerpuff Girls and Johnny Bravo were down in that facility that was next to that abandoned restaurant, whatever it was, on the ground level.
It was awful down there.
Yeah, and I didn't like it. I didn't like being over there at all. And when they made the split, and Turner and whoever the powers that be at Time Warner decided, like, yeah, it's okay, Cartoon Network can start up their own facility, I thought it was the greatest thing ever, especially when we moved in over here.
So give me your overview of the changes, good and bad, that have come. I mean, your career in animation, particularly in television animation, really spans the 60s, where Hanna-Barbera was still a go-go studio, and Bill and Joe had been in that game for about 9 or 10 years when you came in. You didn't work for them initially, but you started with them in the 70s, right?
I didn't actually go on staff at Hanna-Barbera until 1984 or 5. I can't remember the exact. Once again,
you would sub for them for a long time.
Yeah, I had worked on. I was working for people who were doing subcontract work for them through this late 60s and 70s. I had an opportunity to go there and work earlier in the 80s when Bill Kyle was in charge of animation. One day he asked me, like, why don't you come on and work for us, and I'll make you and he called it a junior animator. And I thought, well, that would be taking a pay cut. So I decided that wasn't a good idea at the time. I don't know what would have happened. I only came working in because when I did was because Hannah stopped giving work to the subcontractors and basically told all the subcontractors, whoever was animating for them, that they could go and work for him directly and be on staff. And that's when I started on staff. But when I was working for them, I was working on Hanna-Barbera shows in the late 60s, but I had no idea what Hanna-Barbera was like, because I was working for Fred Calvert, and then I was working for Tony Love and Bill Hunt.
Right.
And my knowledge of the industry was based on what I was doing and where I was. And it wasn't until sometime in the late 70s where I was going in and out of Hanna-Barbera more frequently to drop off and pick up stuff, most likely for contractors. I got a little bit of knowledge of what was going on there. But when I actually started working in, it was fun. It was great. I liked the studio. I liked what was going on, and I enjoyed the time.
You liked the atmosphere.
Yeah, it was great. I really liked the time I spent in Hanna-Barbera. It was fun. I kind of wish sometimes that we were still there.
This buildings are still there, but
Well, it's the shell is still there, but the interior is all different.
Oh, sure.
It's not the same.
Yeah. So as we wrap this up, what's your take on the whole industry from the time, because obviously most of the animation has gone offshore, which wasn't the case when you started.
That's not true. That's not true. People keep saying that, but in a sense, they forget that Jay Ward started that in 1959.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, it started in 1959. It wasn't until the 70s when a lot of work started going out. And it started going to Taiwan, and then eventually went to Korea, and actually went to Philippines, and before, I think, Korea. But, everything's completely different than the way it was when I started. When I started, there was the opportunity to learn just about everything. Today, that's not the case. If you're a young person trying to get into the business, you better be able to know how to do at least one thing already, and it'd be better if you know how to do a couple of different things, because then you have the opportunity to maybe get a job easier. And nowadays, it's submitting portfolios and taking a test. I guess my test was, could I sit down and do an in-between, and I lucked out. I think it's a lot harder to get into the business today.
Yeah, I think it's harder to get into almost anything today.
Yeah, it's tougher, and the business is definitely changed. And a lot of times what happens in the industry now, and at least in television, you see a lot of people that are getting opportunities to do things that may not necessarily be correct at the time because just because of their lack of experience, and hopefully they build from that experience and get better what they do. But a lot of times, in my case now, because I see a lot of storyboards, and especially when you see storyboards that are done by people that don't have that much experience, you realize right off the bat, well, they're doing this because of lack of experience. Maybe 5, 10 years from now, they'll be a whole lot better. But it's different, because when I started out, there were still the veterans that were around, left over from doing feature work.
The 30s and the 40s.
Yeah, and shorts. I was working for guys back then, like when I was at Hanna-Barbera, I was working for Ray Patterson. Ray Patterson was great to work for because he had all this experience and knowledge from working at Disney and all the MGM work that he had done, and he was more than happy to share it with you.
He was one of the great old animators.
He was a really great animator, and he was good at directing, and he would show you how he would do stuff, and he would spend time, if he liked you.
Do you remember any of the things that he said, when you're in this, look at it this way or do it this way?
You know what? He would say, basically, he said one thing to me every time I saw him, and that was, before you left the room, his office, he would always say, keep smiling. That was his words of wisdom to you, keep smiling. But he would also say, when you started getting into directing storyboards, he would say, your job is to make this board work. So you had to solve the problems of the board at the board stage. If there was a problem of length being too long, his attitude was, he was really good at what he did because he could instantly look at the numbers. He would see, like, how big is the storyboard and what's the recorded track coming out to, and he could say, just from his experience, it's too long. And if it was too long, he would just go, sometimes he would rough time it, but he would send it back to the producer and say, hey, cut X amount of footage out of this board because it's too long. But he was really good. And a lot of times he was nice enough to share stories with you from his Disney days and MGM days. And he was a really pleasant, nice man to work for. I really, really enjoyed working with him.
How long did you work with him? 2 or 3 years?
I worked with him in the 80s, and it was probably like from between 85 and to the 90s. What stopped that was he got ill.
Got old.
Well, he was 80 years old when I was working for him, I think. He just liked doing what he was doing, and he got ill and couldn't work anymore. He basically was at home, and I don't remember exactly what happened to him, but he couldn't work anymore. So that's what stopped for him. So once he stopped working, that was my end of my experience of working with him.
Sure.
And that was probably around... Actually, no, he was working into the early 90s because he was around when we did the Jetson feature. And I was still doing work for him. And it was after that, sometime after that, that he got ill. And then I only saw him I think once or twice after that, unfortunately. But it was fun. I enjoyed it.
So the last, okay, well, do you have a summing up? We've gone for an hour, and so we'll start wrapping this up. But what would be, I guess my question would be two-pronged. What are the consistencies that you've seen in the business, things that were true when you started in the 60s, that are still true today, and then what's changed over the period of time, or some big signposts that have changed?
Well, one thing that's always true, that was true back then and is true now, there's always a deadline, and you have to meet that deadline. And if you don't meet the deadline, you're going to always be in trouble. Whether the deadline might be when your work was due, or the deadline may be the shipping date now. There's always a deadline. That never changes, never will change. In television, you're always fighting the clock, and that's the way it is. The changes have been immense. I mean, when I started in the industry, the big thing that was the new state of the art was Xerox. I mean, the fact that they were now Xeroxing on cells and no longer inking. You fast forward to today, there's a tremendous amount of computer work done. Editing's completely changed.
It's all digital.
It's all digital. It's a digital world.
No movie roles, no film.
Although, even though there's a lot of extensive use of computers and and the way they do After Effects and everything that's done, you still have the process in television animation that's not, I'm not talking about Flash and I'm not talking about CG. The hand-drawn shows are still hand-drawn. They may not be hand-drawn in this country, but they're hand-drawn somewhere on the planet. They're still doing storyboards the same old way, and they're still doing everything else the same way. But, there's a modification.
But the big change that I've seen in television from when I started this particular job or was in the biz directly, digital story reels, or animatics as they're called.
That's true. Nowadays, what happens, animatics, I'm not a big fan of animatics, and I'll tell you why. Because what happens in animatics is you get somebody sitting in a room with an editor, an animatic editor, and they're cutting the storyboard down with the track and then allowing for spaces where there's no dialogue. And they're going, yeah, that looks good to me, a few more frames, less frames. But most of these people are not animators, and most of these people have never really done animation direction. So a lot of times what happens is you get an animatic, and now you have the exposure sheets, and you're directing it, because even though these people that are doing that think that they're directing the show, in my opinion, what they're making is a slideshow. They're really not directing anything. They're just making a slideshow, and hope it's really up to the people that follow up to make it work. But a lot of times what happens is you get storyboard or an animatic, and you have a scene where there's not enough footage to do correctly what should be done, and so you're making it work. Sometimes you have to add footage, but it's happens a lot. It's a false sense of timing in television. I'm not talking about story reels and features. I'm talking about animatics and television.
Animatics.
A lot of times it's a false sense of timing.
The storyboard artists complain to me constantly about they now have to do poses and in-betweens to service the animatic in their storyboards, which they didn't do.
Well, I'm not seeing that. So I'm not seeing that in the stuff that I see. That may be true of the shows that are done like at Nickelodeon, where they're doing a lot of CG shows.
I get that complaint at Disney and some other places.
Well, CG shows require storyboards to have a lot more poses in for the animatics, because if it doesn't exist somewhere, the poor sap that's doing the CG animation, and I'm talking about the TV shows that are being done overseas somewhere, what are they going to do? They need a pose, they need a gesture, whatever it is, they need that. And so their boards are more extensive, and the nature of it requires it.
Right.
In television 2D animation, it's not necessarily true. You usually don't see a lot of different poses. You may see sometimes minimum poses. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a handout meeting to do work on a show where there's one pose on a storyboard with a lot of dialogue, and I'm told, like, yeah, do some acting here. No kidding. It's like, yeah, that happens a lot. It's because of a lack of experience of the board artists, because they haven't done enough storyboards themselves to realize, like, no, it's probably not a good idea to have this medium close-up of this guy talking for about 25 feet and not doing anything. It's probably not a good idea. Unless the style of your show is, let's say, Jay Ward style, and the character can stand there.
Right.
But he better be funny.
Illustrated radio.
Yeah, it better be funny.
Now, to wrap up, do you want to give me your? I do this with everybody. Your five favorites, stuff that you've either worked on or haven't worked on in either features, theatrical features, or television. What 5 shows? What 5 features? You don't need to give me 10.
I won't give you 5 features because I don't work in features, and it would just be what features I've seen. I would have loved to have worked on Dalmatians. That's my favorite Disney feature.
It's one of mine too.
And I would have loved to work on that. As far as television shows that I've worked on, I have some favorites. I really liked the time I spent on Samurai Jack. That got me my first Emmy. And I like all the work I've done with Gendy, because I think Gendy does really quality shows, really great art direction, really good shows. So I liked working on Dexter's Lab. I liked working with Craig McCracken. I worked with Craig on Powerpuff Girls and Foster's. I liked those 2 shows. And I liked when I worked on Cow and Chicken with David Feast. That was fun. I like that. Over the course of my career, I've worked on a lot of shows, a lot of different shows. And like I said before, you don't always work on something that you think is great or you think is that you really like, but it's the nature of the beast, and you work on what you can. I'm sure if I think later on, there's going to be shows that I wish I might have worked on. It might have been fun. I would have liked to have started 1 year earlier in my career than I did, because then I missed out by 1 year. Because when I started at Fred Calvert's, the previous year he had done work for Jay Ward on George of the Jungle, so he did a couple of Georges, a couple of Super Chickens, and a couple of Tom Slicks. And if I had been there, I would have got to work.
By 1 year.
By 1 year.
You were 1 year too young.
Yeah, I was one. Yeah, I wish I had started earlier, because then I could have worked on some Jay Ward stuff, because I really like Jay Ward stuff. I would have loved to have worked on shows like Roger Ramjet. I like that. I eventually got to work with guys who worked on that stuff, but I would have liked to work on that. So I like the process of working. I like what I do. It's a lot for me. It's a lot of it's problem solving.
It's a challenge that you like solving.
Yeah, I like what I do. Sometimes you get tired and it's tedious, and you do get tired, and you go, oh gee, I think I could do with a few days off, and that's always good. But I like working, and I think I've worked on some really good stuff. I mean, there'll be critics out there who will have different opinions, and I really don't care. I don't give a shit about them. But I like what I like the fact that I've eventually got to do what I said I was going to do when I was in 8th grade to that kid that was standing next to me in line. I'm happy I got to do that, and I'm glad I got to work at a lot of the places I've worked at. And more importantly, what I tell a lot of people too is I've made friends over the years that I really appreciate the talented people that I've met over the years, and they're almost more important than the shows.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I've been very fortunate and very lucky.
I think on that we will end.
Thank you so much.
Tim Walker probably has more animation credits than anyone who's ever worked in the cartoon industry. From the late 1960s, Tim has animated, assisted, directed, and produced animated product for Warner Brothers, Cartoon Network, Disney, and every cartoon studio in between. Beyond his professional work, Tim has been an avid fan and collector of animation art since his school days. We spoke in his office at Warner Brothers Animation. Today we are talking to Mr. Tim Walker, one of the pillars of Warner Brothers Animation, and who has been in the business for a goodly number of years. How did you get started? Because Robert Alvarez said that you and he used to dumpster dive behind animation studios when you were youths.
Well, that's the truth. Robert's hit it right on the nail. Well, let me start with this. I can remember when I was very young, excuse me, in the early 50s. I was probably about 4 years old, 5 years old, at my grandmother's house, grandparents. And I remember seeing a cartoon on television. And I didn't know what it was, but I thought to myself, that's it. I want to do that.
So when you were 4?
Absolutely. I was hooked. I mean, I might have been 5, but I wasn't any older than 5. And I was hooked. I was hooked. It was probably Heckle and Jekyll or Popeye or one of those early syndicated things that they would run. So I was hooked. I started, I took the crayons and started drawing and just drew as much as I could. And my father at the time owned a sliding glass door factory in Burbank. And he would sell all over the country, so various businessmen and clients and things would come to Los Angeles in the summertime with their families on vacation, and the father would hook up with my dad, and they'd go to the office up in Burbank, and my mother and the wife of whoever it was that was visiting, and their kids, all of us would get together and we'd go to Disneyland. So consequently, in the 1950s when Disneyland first opened, I'll bet you I was there 150 times in the
Wow.
1950s, because they were always taking people to Disney. They were always taking the kids, and the fathers would go to the office and then over to Lakeside Country Club. I won't tell you what happened there. Anyhow, the first stop that I would make after I found out about this place was the Art Corner in Disneyland, in Tomorrowland, where they sold the cells. And they had cells from Peter Pan, Alice in
They were
Wonderland.
production cells for $2 or $3 a pop. right?
Absolutely, that you could buy a large cell, a large framed cell on a, it was like a litho kind of background, not an original background, but a printed background of Peter Pan or the Indian Chief or whatever for $2, and a small one on a color card for $1.25. And I remember seeing behind the counter up on the wall, there was a cell set up from Peter Pan, of Peter Pan, the Indian Chief, and Wendy or the Princess on the original background, and it was $150. And now in the 1950s, that was a lot of money. But, and of course it might as well have been $1 million.
$10,000. right?
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, so I found out more about animation by going to the Art Corner and getting the How to Draw books and buying the cells. And then some people moved in next door to my parents, the Henrys. And Mr. Henry was the head of publicity for ABC television for the entire West Coast. That's everywhere west of the Mississippi River. So and they had a son my age, and we'd play with the other kids in the neighborhood. And he would come over, and the families would socialize all the time. Well, I remember him coming over, the father, one day, and telling me, he'd say, "Tim, you're going to love this new show. It's going to be on ABC, and it's done by the same guys who did Huckleberry Hound and Yogi Bear, and it's called The Flintstones." So I knew about The Flintstones about 6 months before it came out.
Wow.
So then I don't remember exactly how he told me this, but I found out, I'm sure it was Mr. Henry who told me that Hanna-Barbera was in the Cahuenga Pass. And somehow I found out where they were located. Now, they were not in the big building that we all associate as being the old Hanna-Barbera building. They were west, about a block at that signal. There's a concrete block building that has piano keys painted on it. It's a music store.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
could buy it 1,000,000 times. Well, that was the main building for Hanna-Barbera before they hit it really big and built the bigger building. And they rented various bungalows up the street with the animators and layout guys, and a lot of them worked at home.
Oh, yeah. I knew Tony Rivera. He worked at home.
Absolutely, I know Tony Rivera, worked with him many times. Anyhow, I found out where the studio was, and I went to St. Charles Grade School at Lancashire and Moore Park. Well, it was easy to ride straight down Lancashire to Cahuenga West, turn left going east, and go right up Cahuenga West, and there was the trash can behind the building. So started my illustrious career
As a collector.
as a collector in dumpster diving. And I'm sure I've told you this story many times, and I've told it to other people. One time I was dumpster diving, and I heard this, hey you, and I looked up from inside the trash can, and it was Mr. Barbera, although I didn't realize it was Mr. Barbera at the time. And he says, "Get out of that trash can, you knothead." And of course, many years later at I believe it was Mr. Barbera's 90th or 92nd birthday party, they interviewed all the people who were still there from the old H&B studio, and to make a recording to wish Mr. Barbera a birthday greeting. And I said, "Hey, Mr. B, nice to be here on your birthday and help you celebrate your birthday. I bet you don't remember when we first met." And I told that story again, and it got quite a laugh. So funny how things go.
Yeah. Well, he probably didn't remember at that
No,
point.
I'm sure he didn't, but he laughed and nodded, and that's all. It was good enough for me.
Now, then you partnered with Mr. Alvarez.
So I met Robert in, I think it was 57 or 58. We were in the, it was 7th grade. So I think it was 60 when we were in the 7th grade. Yeah, that's right, because the Flintstones were on. And Mr. Henry brought home some cells and gave us some cells. As a matter of fact, they were from the very first episode on backgrounds of the Flintstones. And I brought them to school, and I had met Robert, and like Robert talked about when you interviewed Robert, we both loved cartoons and comic books and drawing and the usual stuff guys like when they're kids growing up. So I brought these cells to school, and I showed them to Robert, and Robert went berserk when he saw them. Of course, I was already berserk about it. I was going to do this. I was going to get into animation by hook or by crook. It was always plan A. There was never, ever...
Plan B.
There was never a plan B. And I think about this today. I find this very interesting. I was obsessed with getting into animation. There was never anything else I was going to do. And it never dawned on me, what if all these cartoons were made years ago and they didn't make these things anymore, or they were made in Europe and I couldn't get there? But luckily, I wind up growing up, with animation in my own backyard.
So how did you get into the business?
Okay, so I went to high school with Robert at Notre Dame High School. We both went to Chenard Art Institute, and at Chenard...
So you were classmates?
Yes, we were classmates with Dale Bear, who Robert talked about. Another guy, great guy, fabulous animator. Never heard more than about 4 words from Dale, but one real nice guy. And Mark Kausler. I remember Mark Kausler when he first came out here from St. Louis, and he wore wingtips and like corduroy pants and a button-down shirt, and he was very prim and proper, right out of the basement with the strawberry preserves from St. Louis. And of course now Mark, I think he got a taste of Hollywood, and
hair's a little longer.
Yeah, hair's a little longer, and he loosened up. But Mark's a great guy, great animator. He was a great animator before he even got to Chenard, and a wonderful guy. Pete Young was in our class.
I knew Pete very well.
Yeah,
he was my best friend at Disney.
Yeah, story guy at Disney, and tragically passed away at a very early age. Heidi Goodell, who became an animator at Disney's, I think.
Knew her?
I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody, but...
and they all were Chenard.
They were all Chenard.
So when was your first job?
My first job, I was hired. Mark Kausler and another friend of mine, Mike Sanger, were working at Fine Arts Films on Archie and Mehetabel for John Wilson. It became Shinbone Alley was the name of the picture. It was 1969. It was the summer of 1969, and Kausler called me and said, hey, get your portfolio together and you can get a job over here as an in-betweener. So I took my portfolio over and I interviewed with Dave Dietich.
Dave Dietich.
Dave Dietich hired me, and I became an in-betweener. And I remember the first thing I worked on, the animator was Frank Gonzalez, and it was a parade scene, and there was all this confetti falling down. Of course, the in-betweener's nightmare, because you've got 10 million pieces of paper falling.
And you got to track
and you got to track it all and in between it. But that was my first experience in the business. It was 1969 summer, and I think my first payroll check was for $69.37.
But you didn't have to wait a month like Robert.
No, these guys, thank God, were legit. And and I was still going to school at the time. So, but I worked that summer, and that was my first gig, 1969, and I did assistant work for Frank Gonzalez, Bob Bransford, Frank Andrina, John Sperry, and of course John Sperry. I hit it off real well with John Sperry because Kausler and I sat in the same room for a while, and of course we both loved animation and cartoons, and we both loved old movies, and John was a big movie fan.
Oh yeah,
and
great guy.
Really a nice guy. And I remember one of the first scenes I did assistant work on for John, it was of Mehetabel the cat. And of course John didn't trust anybody with anything, so he didn't leave very much for anybody. But it was a scene of Mehetabel talking about something and then leaning into the camera with a big full face. And so I did all the assistant work and I took it to him, and he literally took 5 drawings, the first 5, put them on the pegs and rolled them. Really, I mean, he really checked it out. And he says to me, he goes, well, if I was to be brutally honest,
Sounds like John.
this ear is a little bit out of arc, but I think it will do. And I knew John liked me, and I made it through with the scene fine. It was okay. So that was on Archie Mehetabel at or Shinbone Alley, I'm sorry, 1969, John Wilson Fine Arts Films.
So you got away from the confetti.
I got away from the confetti. I did some character stuff. I worked with Frank Onitis. Jules Engel was there, who I had as a teacher at Chenard. Ambi Palawota was there, and I did assistant work for Ambi Palawota, and I remember some scenes that he did that were just absolutely beautiful, beautiful. And I hit it off really well with Ambi. He liked me a lot. I had a lot of enthusiasm, and he used to tell us old Disney stories and stuff, so he was a very fascinating guy to talk with. And of course he had his temper too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, your thing with the confetti, Rolly Crunk told me he was in charge of tracking all the spots on the dogs in 101 Dalmatians.
What a
It was
night.
his job to make sure they didn't shift. So that's kind of the equivalent of the
Well,
confetti.
Yeah, that's true. And if Robert loves that movie, it would have been Robert's luck to get a job on that movie and do all the dots.
Yeah, would have been. Okay, so you finished with Shinbone Alley,
Mm-hmm.
and what's your next gig after
My
that?
next gig is I hooked up with Robert over at Hutton and Love and did assistant work over there with Robert, with Bill Hutton, Tony Love, and Ed Love. And that was a workout because anybody who works for Ed Love, he was a great animator, great action animator, but boy, you had to really be on the mark because he animated so rough. You really had to be a top flight draftsman, and I really wasn't all that good at that time. So it was a struggle. It was really, and we were doing the Harlem Globetrotters, and of course
A lot of action.
a lot of action, but every one of those characters was caricatured. And, everybody was making Xerox reductions and blow-ups of the heads of the characters, the model sheets, and tracing them because you couldn't draw that stuff. It was just, you needed a top-flight draftsman to do it.
Yeah.
But we worked on the Harlem Globetrotters, C-Lab 2020. This is like 1970, 71 time period.
Yeah.
Or no, this was 1970 because I wasn't there all that long. I got a call from Ambi Palawota, who was working on Heavy Traffic, Ralph Bakshi's second picture after Fritz the Cat. And they needed some help finishing up assistant work, and Ambi called me and said, come on down. And I went down and started at Ralph Bakshi's. It was with Steve Krantz Productions.
Mm-hmm.
Ralph was still there, but Ralph was starting his own studio, unbeknownst to Krantz, I think.
Yeah, because I
And-
think they parted company.
Exactly. So I worked on Heavy Traffic, and Ambi was there, Virgil Ross was there, Manny Perez was there, a lot of really great old-time animators. And then when Heavy Traffic finished, Johnny Walker was there. When Heavy Traffic finished, Ralph had opened up, and he was doing a film called Coonskin, which later became Street Fight, I believe they called it. I went with Ralph, and I was with Ralph from, I believe it was 70 or 71 to 75.
Well, you probably became an animator in the course of all
Well,
that.
I animated a little bit there, but not much. There were a couple of young guys that made animation, but I was reasonably good as an assistant and fast, and I think they needed people like that to help production get through. But I'll tell you an interesting story about Ralph. Ralph loved ping pong. We had a ping pong table down there. And I used to sit in this back office with Fred McManus.
Yeah.
I loved him. I used to ride to the studio with him, and we'd sit in this old back closet. In fact, there was an old water heater in this closet. And we had our animation desk back there, and we'd do our assistant work. And all of a sudden I'd hear this, Tim! Tim! And I'd come out, and there'd be Ralph standing behind the ping pong table.
And we'll cut it off for a second.
So I would come out of my room and there'd be Ralph behind the ping pong table and he'd want to play ping pong. Now, Ralph couldn't beat me and it drove him crazy.
He's not a good loser.
No, he's not, and I'm probably a stupid winner because I'm beating the boss on a regular basis. Now, Irv Spence was also there. Now, talk about a
One of the top
great
animators.
Great, and wonderful guy. Absolutely a wonderful guy. He liked ping pong too, and Irv couldn't beat me. Of course, Irv was quite a few years older than both Ralph and I at that point. But anyhow, and this went on, and Don Selders, who was the production manager at the studio, who was originally Irv Spence's assistant. Don was a great assistant. One of these guys who was a key assistant, but a real assistant animator.
Yeah.
Don became the production coordinator, manager. And it would drive Don nuts because Ralph would want me to play ping pong with him all day long. And I would sit there for 3 or 4 hours constantly playing ping pong. I got so tired of it. I just, oh man.
Did you fall behind your footage?
No, I never fell behind in my footage. I don't know how I didn't, but I made it through okay. And finally, one day, I got so fed up with the ping pong deal, I finally let Ralph beat me. And of course, Irv Spence was working at home that day. So Ralph had to get on the phone immediately and call Irv Spence and tell Irv, oh, I finally beat the little bastard. I finally beat him.
But you threw the game.
Yeah, I threw the game. I never told Ralph that. Now, and interesting, Ralph never realized my game of ping pong, and I'll give it up now because I can't play anymore anyhow, but I was strictly defense. I never had an offense, but I could make you hit the ball into the net. I could pretty much make you hit the ball off the table by the way I would hit the ball back. So it's funny, just this last year in San Diego at the comic convention in 2010, I was down there with my wife Susan and my kids, and Ralph was there doing a book signing. And so I saw him, he had a bunch of people around him, and I was just kind of standing there looking at him with my arms folded, and he looks up and looks over at me and kind of cocks his head with a kind of a squint and goes, "Do I know you? Do I know you?" And I said, "Do you like to play ping pong?" "Walker, is that you?" And of course he was thrilled to death to see me, gave me a big hug, and I had done a book, and I gave him a copy of my book and signed it, and Ralph signed a copy of his book for me, and it was really fun to see him. It was really great, and I said, "Gee, Ralph, should I tell you how come I won all those games?" And, "How'd you win? You cheated, didn't you?" "No, I just played defense the whole time," and so I let the cat out of the bag.
I can't play anymore anyway, so I'm not going to, there's no rematch.
Yeah, there's no rematch, not now. Although, I don't know, I'll have to try it left-handed, but we can talk about that later. So I was at Ralph's, I believe, until 75.
Yeah.
And then in 75, I did some, Mark Kausler was doing animation, I think, at Spun Buggy Works, commercials. And I did assistant work for Mark for about a year. And in 76, I went to Sanrio when Sanrio opened, and they did Metamorphosis, The Winds of Change, the animated feature.
Yeah.
And I got a job as an animator on the feature. I had taken a class with Benny Washam that he used to teach out of his garage up off of Laurel Canyon. And I took the scene in and showed it to Willie Ito was in charge. Takashi was the director-producer. And I got a job as an animator, and I loved working there because it was a very lax place to work at. I mean, you could spend weeks on a scene, and probably it ultimately became its undoing. But for a solid year, I worked under Amby and Ed Ardell, who I just absolutely loved. Ed Ardell was one of the greatest guys I'd ever worked with down there. Ray Patterson was there. Manny Perez was there. And the first guy, and I'll always be beholden to this guy, the first guy I picked up animation from in 1976 was from, and he was a sequence director, was Jerry Eisenberg.
Oh, Jerry, yeah,
Yeah.
he's still trucking along.
Oh yeah, Jerry and I have been fast friends ever since, and but I'll always be grateful to Jerry. He gave me my first scenes of animation, and it was of Perseus, where it was based on Greek mythology, and it was where Perseus has the wings on his feet, on his shoes, and he's flying all around and doing all this stuff, and I had a blast. And a lot of the guys who had worked for Ralph Bakshi had come over to work on Metamorphosis when I think Ralph had a little bit of a downtime. But it was a great experience, and of course I went to all those guys for help. I mean, I didn't do this great animation or anything, but I did some adequate animation with the help of a lot of these old timers, and it was great to just have them there, and every one of them was just a real nice. There was another guy there, Glenn Schmidt, who was an assistant from Disney's, and he helped me a tremendous amount. But it was great because you had the opportunity to be among these guys and really learn something.
Guys that went all the way back to the 30s.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
And some earlier than that.
Ambi went back to 35
Yeah.
at Disney's, and of course Ray Patterson was in the 30s at Mintz and at Disney's. And I'll never forget, Ray Patterson did a scene, I was looking at it one day, of when Perseus becomes a deer and these dogs are chasing him, and it's kind of a perspective shot where he's running up a river towards the camera and goes past the camera, and this group of dogs goes past him. And it was just the rough drawings, but I flipped it, and boy, it just was right out of Bambi. I mean, it was that good. It was gorgeous. So I really enjoyed the fact that I could get help from those guys and learn something. And Eddie Ardell, the great effects animator, soft-spoken, wonderful guy, patient, would look at your drawings, make suggestions, show you how to do this and that. So it was a real treasure trove of an opportunity to learn something, because that opportunity is not going to happen all the time.
So that Sanrio period, that 1976 period, that's where you really you became a full-fledged animator.
Right, and at the same time, Fred Wolf, who lived up the street from me when I was growing up, just to backtrack for a minute, in 1964 or 65, I was a gopher at Murakami Wolf when they were down on Tamaran Street. I was only there for a summer, but I knew Fred. So in '76, they did A Mouse and His Child, the animated feature.
Right.
So while I was working at Sanrio animating, I also picked up freelance animation from Swenson. I can't think of his first name.
But all the guys from that period, I know it's true of my father-in-law, Charlie Downs, it's true of you, it's true of Robert Alvarez. You guys were working all the time. You were doing your day job, you were picking up from somebody else and working at home at night and on the weekends.
Yep.
And it was basically everybody had a light board at home, light board in the studio. Wasn't that pretty much the routine for everybody?
Absolutely. I mean, you could do as much work as you wanted to, or as little as you wanted to, as long as you met whatever the requirement was at whatever individual studio you were at. You could do it. And, I mean, there were plenty of people that would just come in and, screw around most of the time and just barely get their footage out. And there were other people that were like machines that just couldn't do enough of it and realized there was money to be made.
Oh yeah. So I have another question, and that is, did you find that your Notre Dame experience, that being nose to the grindstone in high school, did that help you at all when you got into?
I really didn't, because I have a different perspective than Robert has, and I was so keyed in about getting into animation by any way possible. I was drawing and doing all that stuff, and I really D'd and F'd my way through Notre Dame High School. How I ever graduated is a miracle. I mean, it really absolutely is, because I don't know how I stayed in there.
You weren't on a dean's list, is
No, I was on the detention list. I was in detention after school every night.
that D list?
Yeah, I was on the D list. So I don't know. I have always had a good work ethic. Always. I don't know if it was. I mean, when I was growing up as a kid, I did the dishes and took the trash out. I put the dishes into the dishwasher cleaner than when they came out of the dishwasher, I think. I had a brother who did all the yard work and everything. He loved doing that. So whether the work ethic was instilled in me there or, I don't know.
But it didn't come from high school.
No, it didn't come from high school. I'll tell you to backtrack a little interesting story. Before I enrolled in Chenard, my parents were members of Lakeside Country Club, and Walter Lance became a member of Lakeside.
Yeah.
And Robert and I and my father met him and told him how I wanted to get into animation. And Robert and I used to go down and visit Walter Lance. This was in between high school and college. And of course he'd always give us a stack of cells and drawings and stuff like that and show us around the studio and everything. And I remember we had to get the paperwork signed, our application to Chenard signed by some people or something. And I remember Walter Lance signed mine. I thought that was pretty cool. But anyway,
So you knew the players even before you went to art school.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now we're up to the late 70s, and you're a full-fledged animator.
Okay.
And did you segue into being a director in there, or was it in the 80s
Well,
that you...
what happened was, after I finished at Sanrio, I was at Sanrio in 76. In 77, I went to DePatie Freeling, and I animated at DePatie Freeling in 77. And great old gal who's now gone, I call her kind of the mother of the industry, Mabel Getzner.
Mabel. Oh, yeah.
Mabel.
She was over at Disney.
For years, and I didn't see her for years while she was there, and I'm sorry I didn't. But I knew her very well. I knew her at Sanrio, and I knew her she called me and said, hey, I think they're hiring here at DePatie. You should call Lee Gunther and get over here. And I did, and she got me in there. And then she went to Hanna-Barbera in 78, and she called me up and said, Hanna-Barbera's hiring, why don't you come over? And I went over, I took some artwork over, and I showed it to Bill Kyle, and I got hired as an animator at Hanna-Barbera in 78, and pretty much stayed with them. There were a couple of times, one time I left and went to Filmation in 79. I also went to Filmation in 72 for a brief period, but I didn't care for Filmation. I didn't like their stuff.
Many didn't.
No, I didn't like their stuff. But I worked off and on at Hanna-Barbera, pretty much Hanna-Barbera, right up until they merged. I was there from straight through. I was there from 78 to 88 because it was, and then I went to
She had a
Disney.
10 or 11 year run.
Yeah, and animated on the Smurfs and all the stuff that they did. I liked working on the Smurfs. They were easy to draw, except the crowd scenes. You get all those Smurfs in there, youch. But they were easy to draw, and I enjoyed it. But so I was an animator there with Robert, Jeff Hall, Bob Hathcock,
Right.
Rich Trueblood, John Tucker was there, Floyd Norman was there, a lot of these great old guys. Marty Strudler was there in background. So I was an animator, and then once animation left the studio and really went overseas, they took a bunch of the young guys, and you had an opportunity to either go into storyboarding or to learn animation direction under Ray Patterson. And I looked at storyboarding, and I always thought, there are so many guys that can just draw rings around me, and to make any money, you got to be good and fast.
Right, good and fast. So you did your share of boarding at one time or
Oh
another.
yeah, I've done a little bit of board, not a lot, surprisingly not a lot, but I have done a little bit. But I decided to go into animation directing, And I mean, I've made a lot of mistakes in my life over the years, but this one was the right choice. And I learned from Ray Patterson, and I know Robert learned from Ray Patterson. Great, great animator for Disney's and MGM. Great director. Showed you all the ins and outs, and
So he was a good teacher.
absolutely, absolutely, he was a great teacher. And I remember a friend of mine back in Florida. He has nothing to do with animation, but he's such a huge fan of MGM. He's interviewed all the MGM guys, and I think he wanted to do a book about MGM, but could never quite get it off the ground. Anyhow, he was very close friends with Ray Patterson, and Ray had some real nice complimentary things to say about me and Robert. We started slugging boards and writing. We started by writing exposure sheets.
So what was your first exposure sheet experience with what show? Or do you remember?
Actually, the first show I did exposure sheets on, we have to backtrack just a little bit here, because after I animated at Hanna-Barbera, I left Hanna-Barbera to go to Marvel and work with John Gibbs, who Robert's already talked about. And I was on
You were saying that Gibbs was fairly nice to you.
Gibbs was fairly nice to me. I don't know why he liked me, but he did. And but I had seen firsthand how brutal he could be. I don't want to mention any names, but one very dear friend of mine, he was just brutal to on a regular basis, and to the point of being embarrassing. And I really couldn't stand that. But anyhow, so I learned a little bit of directing from Gibbs, which was not really learning any directing. It was just, this is how we do it at Marvel. It was on the show The Transformers at the time that Marvel did it. Transformers and G.I. Joe. It was like 1980, I believe.
Oh yeah, I remember that show lasted a long time, and now it's come around again.
Now it's coming back again. And so I was there for just a while. My friend Jeff Hall was there with me, who was doing the same thing. Robert came in for a while, and then Jeff and I got calls from Hanna-Barbera, and they offered us contracts to come back to Hanna-Barbera. So we decided we're going back, and we left Robert and kind of left him in the lurch, I guess.
He didn't stay long.
No, he didn't stay long. I'm glad he got out of there. But anyhow, so I went back to Hanna-Barbera, and then we hooked up with Ray Patterson. You know, learned animation. Learned directing, timing, and that kind of stuff. And we started doing exposure sheets on the Smurfs, on the Trollkins. Oh God, so many shows I can't even. The 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo.
So you were directing at Hanna-Barbera for a bunch of years in the 80s.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Up until I was directing there up until '88.
We continue now with Tim Walker's interview.
So you were directing at Hanna-Barbera for a bunch of years in the 80s.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Up until I was directing there up until '88. I got laid off, and Disney TV called me and offered me a job. Michael Webster was running the studio
Oh
at the
yeah,
time.
he was their first guy. He started there about 85, 86.
Right. This was right at they had already started the Wuzzles, I think it was, and the Gummy Bears, I think.
Their first big series.
Yeah, and then they had just started DuckTales. So I went over to Disney's, and I was going to do exposure sheets. This was '88. I was going to do exposure sheets, and I walked down the hall, and I ran into my friend Bob Hathcock. And Bob was producing, Alan Zaslav had produced DuckTales the first season. He moved on to another show, and Bob had taken over as producer on the show. I ran into Bob. Bob asked me what I was doing there, and I told him. He said, "No, you're not. You're going to slug boards for me." And that's when I really got my feet wet slugging boards, because we were slugging them, really breaking down all the action. So
you're really supervising the exposure sheet
oh yeah,
guys.
the exposure sheet guys are really just copying what I'm putting down, and I was slugging like 100 pages a day of all broken down stuff. That's a lot.
Well, you have a reputation of being sort of the workhorse of television animation. I think you have probably done you have probably directed and slugged more shows than anybody else ever, but certainly anybody else currently working. I bet, how many shows do you think that you have directed, slugged, written sheets for? How many, give me a guesstimate.
Different shows, you mean?
The total number of episodes.
Oh my God! Well, if you stop and figure, there's what 52 episodes in a syndication package.
Well, there used to be, yeah, it varies now, but yeah, 52 was it. They
Oh
do.
my God! I couldn't even venture to guess. I mean, oh God, thousands.
2,000, 3,000.
Oh,
You've
probably 5,000.
You've probably directed. Yeah, I mean,
You know-
and because you were a wild man. You were doing it during the day. You were supervising somebody else at night.
I remember one weekend I was living in Lancaster, and I did 1,800 feet in one weekend, and that was half of it was Disney's and half of it was Warner Brothers. And you know, I have this big reputation of having done all this stuff and written all that stuff, like you say, and everything, and I think I'm reasonably good at it. And the reason I think that is because, and I don't say that out of
You keep working.
I keep working, but I don't say that out of pride or anything, or you know, I can't think of the right word, bragging or being braggadocious or anything. I love what I do. I have always loved what I do. I've worked for every studio in this town, and my favorite by far was Hanna-Barbera. I loved every minute of it. That's because I grew up watching Rough and Ready, Huckleberry Hound, Yogi Bear.
The
and
Flintstones.
The Flintstones. And these guys were my heroes. I mean, I love the Disney stuff. I love the MGM stuff. I love the Warner Brothers stuff. I mean, it's great, great stuff. But there's something about that nostalgic growing up as a kid. And now I'm working, you know, for my
It's all
heroes.
still out there. It's still all on the air. It's all still being
Oh,
seen.
yeah. Oh, God, if I only got some residual payments, boy, I'd really be in Fat City.
You'd be in Fat City.
Oh, boy, would I ever. But yeah, I've done an awful lot of footage over the years, and I always looked at it like animation is gone now, a lot of it for us because of it going overseas. But I look at a board, and if you've got a board with a lot of nice poses on it, a good board that a really good artist has done, I'm basically animating by telling the animators how fast or how slow to go in and out of these poses.
You're timing it.
And timing it, and where to hold, where to move, where to pan, whatever. So I bring the knowledge that I was taught by the guys who I learned from. I enjoy doing that. I mean,
The old MGM guys.
oh gosh, yes. I mean, I look out the window and I see these guys digging ditches and watering the lawn. And I don't want to do that stuff. I mean, how lucky are you to grow up and live your dream? And I lived my dream. There's no question about it.
So how long? You started at Disney in '88, and you were working
I was
for
there until
Hathcock.
I was working with Hathcock, and then I became directing, and then I worked with Jamie Mitchell on Tailspin, which was another great series, and then one of the producers left, and I became a producer on Tailspin, on the last 3 episodes of the series, I think it was, and then we went to Darkwing Duck. I was one of 4 producers on Darkwing Duck, and it's kind of a funny story. I mean, everybody on that show was really talented, and a lot more talented than I ever was. But I was a producer of a group of guys.
So when you were producing, what were you in charge of doing? Were you mainly in charge of the direction? You weren't in charge. You weren't in charge of the story development necessarily.
No,
right?
no. We'd get a script and we'd hand out to the storyboard guys, and they'd board it, and then I kind of worked closer with the guys doing the sheets and slugging than anything else, because yeah, I mean those shows pretty much get themselves done. You've got really good people working on it. So, but an interesting situation happened. One of the producers on the show who came back from overseas, and a lot of the times at Disney TV, when you come back from overseas as a supervisor overseas, kind of a bonus you would get is a lot of the times they'd make you a producer on one of the series shows. So anyway, something happened with this producer and there was a falling out, and all of a sudden I inherited like 10 more episodes to do. In those days they did 65 half hours. And ABC, which was owned by Disney's, decided they were going to run 13 episodes of Darkwing Duck on their, I guess it was their Saturday morning schedule. So they came to the and the group of guys I had, my crew, were great guys, wonderful guys, but we were always considered kind of the ragtags, the wannabes. You know, we weren't quite up to like the elite.
The irregulars.
Yeah, we were the irregulars. So we, you know, I just said, look, we got nothing to, we don't have to prove anything to anybody. Let's just have a good time with this. And so ABC came in, and out of the 65 episodes, they picked 13 episodes out of, it was either 4 or 5 producers at the time. And 7 of the shows they picked were our shows. And I thought, you know what?
Like what you were doing.
Yeah, we did something right. So
Because there was a syndication package and then a network package.
exactly,
Right?
you're right. That was the network package. And then after Darkwing Duck ended, I was living in Lancaster at the time, and I wanted to work at home again because, man, it was a long drive.
That's an hour and
It's
something
like-
each way, isn't it?
It's like a good hour each way. So we started the Aladdin, the feature had come out, been a huge success, and they started the Aladdin TV show. So I went back to just slugging and writing sheets, and I worked on about maybe a half a dozen episodes. And I got a call from Marvel, they were going to do Spider-Man again, and I was pretty fed up with working at Disney's at that point. I don't remember exactly why.
Well, you have I looked on IMDb and you've got a list of stuff that you worked on longer than King Kong's arm. I mean, it's,
Well, I've been lucky. I've been really, really lucky. So I went to Marvel and I worked on Spider-Man for a while. Oh, and I got to backtrack because there's another good story here. While I was at Disney TV working with Bob Hathcock on DuckTales, Liza Ann Warren, who was Bob's production coordinator and came from Hanna-Barbera with Bob. In fact, I think they were at CBS first when CBS had a studio. Liza's been with Bob for a long, long time at that point. And Liza was the production manager / coordinator, associate producer, whatever, on DuckTales with Bob. Well, we were working on the DuckTales series, and then we did the DuckTale feature,
Mystery of the Lost Lamp.
yeah, I think Mystery of the Lost Lamp or something like that. And I slugged the whole thing and supervised all the exposure sheets on that show. Anyway, Liza, for some reason, left the studio and went to Warner Brothers.
She was over there sort of as a right-hand man for quite a while.
She was. And I got a phone call one day. Now, I was under contract. I guess I can talk about this now, but I was under
Statute of limitations has run out.
I was under contract at Disney's, which means I guess I was supposed to only work on their product. I got a phone call from Liza. And Liza says to me, hey, let's have lunch. I mean, I was good friends with Liza. She really liked me. I was getting the job done and all of that. So she says, why don't you come on over? We'll go to the Valley Inn and I'll buy you lunch. So I wanted to see Liza. I liked her very much. And so I went over and had lunch with Liza. And in those days, shall we say, that I enjoyed a libation or two. Actually, those in the know it's a heck of a lot more than that. But anyway, so we went to the Valley Inn, and I had a couple of libations with lunch. And she says to me, well, come on over, let me show you what we're working on. And they had just started up the Batman, the first Batman series, the one that Bruce Timm and Eric Radomski.
Right, the one that really sort of broke the mold and sort of got back to the DC comic noir stuff.
Oh yeah, absolutely. They were influenced by the Max Fleischer Superman cartoons and that film noir 30s and 40s look, and you got Eric Radomski and Bruce Timm, both great artists, heading this thing up. So I went over to look at it and say, yeah, this is neat, this is really cool. And she says to me, well, when can you pick up a board to slug? Of course, I thought for a second. Of course, at that point, I wasn't feeling too much pain, and I said to myself, I said, "Well, I guess I could take one now." That phone call and saying, "Yeah, I guess I could take one now," has led to 21 years at Warner Brothers.
21 years at Warner Brothers. That's a
21
long. So
years.
how much longer did you stay at Disney? At some point,
Well, I left Disney. I left Disney in '94, and I went to Marvel. And during this whole time period, I'm still doing freelance on all the Batman shows.
yeah, yeah.
So I left Disney, went to Marvel. I worked on Spider-Man with Bob Richardson for about not long, just maybe 2 or 3 months. And I had gotten a call from Warner Brothers. They needed a director on the Sylvester and Tweety Mysteries that they were doing.
Yeah.
And they offered me a job on it. And I said, "Well, I'm working for Marvel. I don't think I can do it right now. Let me think about it." And something happened at Marvel. I got fed up. Oh, I know what it was. Bob Richardson and I had kind of a difference of opinion, I guess, over, it really wasn't a difference of opinion. He was looking at a storyboard that I had slugged.
Yeah.
And he was telling me, "Well, I wouldn't have done this there, I would have done that." And I said, okay. And then finally, after telling me all this stuff, I went, "Oh my God, I get it now, Bob. I get it. I followed the board. How could I have been so stupid? I followed the board." Because he was talking about things that weren't even, you wouldn't have known it, that this was supposed to happen, or you were supposed to do this, because it
was in his head.
Yeah, there was no indication. Not that there's nothing wrong with Bob. Bob's a great director and producer, many years in this business. It was just a situation that came up. So
he didn't take kindly to that remark, or
well, he just kind of laughed a little bit about it. But I went out the door, made a phone call to Warner's and said, "I'll be over full time." And I started the next Monday as a director on the first season of Sylvester and Tweety Mysteries.
and that was like
That was-
89 or 90 then, wasn't it?
No, that was 94.
94.
That was 94. And then Mike Gerard, who's a very good friend of mine, Mike Gerard was producing the series at the time, and then he quit to go to something else. I can't remember what it was, and they offered me the job as producer. And I didn't really want to take the job. I don't have the ego to be a producer. I don't care all that much. But there were 2 or 3 young guys who wanted to direct, who were storyboard guys, and they kind of lobbied me to take the job. And I said, "Okay, I'll take the job to produce the show, and you guys can direct, but you're going to direct. I don't want to direct these things. I'll help you with timing. I'll help you with whatever you need help with." But these guys became directors. And an interesting thing on the Sylvester and Tweety Mysteries was, we've seen Tweety and Sylvester for years and years and years, the same old situation. It had Granny, Hector the Bulldog, Sylvester and Tweety. Now those characters are etched in stone. You can't change the design or anything because this is the known character. Well, I came up with an idea. If we can't change the designs of the characters, let's change the overall look of every episode. In other words, if you're going to do a show and you're at home over the weekend and it's a show where Sylvester and Tweety are in the jungle, for example, and you happen to see some illustration in a magazine a guy's done of a jungle scene or something that just really knocks you out. You really love the way this guy drew his vision of a jungle. It could be flat graphic like UPA, it could be lush and green and beautiful like Disney's. Whatever floats your boat, let's change the background design every episode. So we get something new and fresh in every episode.
Different look.
A different look. And it was great. It was really, really great. Again, I had top flight people working for me. And I've always felt, I'll give away a secret, but I've always felt, let these people do their job.
Oh, yeah.
Let them do their job. Encourage them. When I saw somebody do something really good, I always told them, "Boy, I love what you're doing. I keep doing that. That's great." Pat them on the back.
Give them some positive reinforcement.
Absolutely. You can get a lot out of an artist with that and not have to give them a raise. I mean, if I had If I had the power to give them raises, I would have, but I didn't have that power. But to pat them on the back and give them encouragement and let them work doing what they love to do and be creative
Yeah.
at it.
Yeah.
Consequently, I came out looking like a genius. You know, it was a no-brainer.
Because you let everybody do their thing, and the shows turned out great.
Absolutely. And now, Tom, I have to say, I was the producer on the art side of the Sylvester and Tweety Mysteries. Tom Mitten, another dear friend of mine, writer and wonderful artist, was the producer on the writing side. He handled all the writing. And I've always fantasized about going to a roast for Tom Mitten. I'm sure you must know Tom.
Yeah.
I'd love to go to a roast, and my line when I get up to the podium to say something about Tom, I would get up there and I would say, now Tom Mitten is without a doubt the funniest guy I've never heard. Because he mumbles kind of under his breath and I can never understand what he's talking about.
Never understand a word that he says.
So, okay, so we're at Warner Brothers doing Sylvester and Tweety. And of course I'm freelancing, I'm still doing Batman.
Well, this is the period where Warner's was firing on all 8 cylinders, and I remember you from that period. You were basically doing multiple shows a week, and you were basically at the top of your game in terms of footage and output.
Absolutely. I was living in Lancaster. I was working on weekends. My kids would sit on my lap watching me work while I'd be watching old Universal horror movies or W.C. Fields. Or
And working.
Westerns. And working. And loving every minute of it. Grateful to have the money. I mean, I had a great house and got to raise great kids. It was just, I was fortunate. I was really fortunate to fall into the business that I loved and be able to make a good, solid living at it. So, I mean, what more do you want?
And you've stayed at Warner Brothers from '94 straight through to now, 2010.
Exactly.
And you've worked other places on the side, but...
I've done a lot of other stuff. Here's an interesting story. I know Robert mentioned Samurai Jack and Gindie. And I love Gindie's shows. I think they're wonderful. And especially Samurai Jack. What a beautiful show that was. I loved the look of it. Anyhow, Tom Mitten and myself have been nominated for so many Emmys. I used to joke around with some of the guys around here. Yeah, I feel like the Erica Kane.
Right. Always nominated but never awarded.
Yeah, but never awarded. And so I got tired of going. I decided, you know what, I'm not going. So Robert calls me and says, hey, you worked on the Samurai Jack with me. It got nominated, so you're nominated. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's nice. And there was a gal there. I can't remember her name. She was a production coordinator. She wanted to go to the Emmys because she had worked on Samurai Jack that was nominated. And she wanted to go to the Emmys so bad. And I said, you know, take my tickets. I don't want to go.
I can't bear another loss.
No, yeah. Well, I just was tired. I didn't want to go. And wouldn't you know it, that's the night we won. And would have
both you and Robert won.
Exactly. And this is why I'm really sad that I didn't go, because I think this is really special. My best friend for 50 years. We go dumpster diving, we do all kinds of things together. We win Emmys, the first one for both of us. Now, I've only won one. Robert's got a closet full, but we won't talk about that.
That's right.
But I just thought it was so cool. It would have been so nice to have had a photograph of both of us holding an Emmy. You know, the first ones that we've won in our careers, or be lucky enough to win. I just thought that would have been a great remembrance, you know.
Oh yeah. So, now, as we wrap up here, I've got one last question, because I asked this of everybody, and it's basically your 5 favorite features and or television shows that you worked on or didn't work on. Sure.
Get into it.
Okay. Well, before we get into that last question, you started having a little difficulty with your gun hand, your drawing hand.
Oh yes, yes. In 2007, I started to notice a weakness in my right arm, and I thought, for the life of me, it had to be carpal tunnel syndrome from all the drawing and writing over the years. And so I went to the doctor over at the motion picture over here in Toluca Lake, Dr. Weissman, who's a very dear, close personal friend of mine. And he checked me out and he said, you have to go see a neurologist. So I went to the neurologist and went through a bunch of tests. Great neurologist, Dr. Lancelot Alexander from Jamaica, I think he's from. Great guy. He throws a left hook that just drops me right to my knees. Lateral Parkinson's disease on my right side, which has basically pretty much fried my right arm and right leg.
That's the same thing that Michael J. Fox has.
But Michael J. Fox has it on both sides. This is lateral, and it's just on the right side. And when he tells me this, he tells me 99 and 9/10% of the people who get it laterally get it on their left side. Well, if I'm going to get it, Murphy's Law, I'm getting it on my right side, good and proper.
That's your drawing.
Yeah, that's my drawing hand, so that's the side I'm getting it on. I don't want any weak sister business. I'm getting it on my right. Anyway, when I left the doctor's office, I really crawled out of that doctor's office because I figured my career is over. It's going to disintegrate right in front of my eyes. So that was my thinking for about 10 minutes. And then I thought to myself, well, I still know how to draw. I'm going to teach myself to write and draw left-handed. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to at least attempt it to see if I can do it. Because I know whatever I do, no matter how bad it is, it's going to get better if I keep doing it. So I go to the bookstore and I buy a sketchbook. I open it up. On the very first page, I write in the sketchbook, drawings from the left. And I start drawing and I dated it. I believe I think it's June 7th, or June 11th, 2007. I'm not exactly right on the date, but...
That's 3.5 years ago.
Right. And the first drawing I did, surprisingly, was not very bad at all. In fact, many people were kind of shocked that it was as good as it was. So I came back to the studio, and my boss at the time was Howard Schwartz, and I told Howard what the situation was, and Howard says to me, look, I don't pay you for beautiful calligraphy. I pay you for what you know, your knowledge. As long as we can read your slugs and read the sheets, you're here. And I thought to myself, well, there's the first step in the right direction.
Oh, yeah.
So I have not drawn a thing since that day right-handed. I have drawn numerous
things.
And
you do sheets and slugging left-handed,
I do sheets and
too.
slugging. Now I'm a little... Slugging is fine. My sheets, my printing is not as good as, I want it to be better, but, what are you going to do?
But you use your left hand,
But
right?
I use my left hand. So I started filling up these sketchbooks. And my wife, Susan Crosley, another wonderful animation artist and wonderful gal, says to me, my God, these drawings are wonderful. I kept getting all this encouragement. She's my biggest fan, biggest support. So I started thinking about a year and a half ago, I'm going to do a book. I'm going to call it Drawings from the Left, or Parkinson's Pictures. And it's a book about inspiration, total inspiration. I am as shocked as everybody else is that sees this book at the quality of the drawings.
Well, I've seen it, and the drawings are terrific.
And I'm shocked. I'm totally shocked. But what I want to do now is I've set up a website, and the book will be for sale on Amazon in late January. I fully believe now my goal is to inspire people. If I can get through what I've done, and I don't know how long this is going to last. I don't know if this disease is going to go to my left side. I just figure I'm on the clock. So every second that I get where I'm not working, I pick up a pencil and I just draw. I've fallen back in love with what I loved doing as a child. So I did this book, And I want it out there for people to be inspired. Anybody who's going through anything. I did this, I didn't lay down my tent and fold my tent and pack it in and lay down and feel sorry for myself. I got back up and just started chugging ahead. And you can do it. That's what you do in life,
Yeah.
So
Pick yourself up off the canvas and
I didn't get
go
knocked,
another round.
Yeah, I didn't get knocked out in the 9th. I still got the 10th round. I'm in the 10th, maybe the middle of the 10th. I don't know. But I'm loving what I do, and people love the book, and it's always a good idea to give a little publicity for the book on the
Oh
blog.
yeah, and
so-
we'll put the cover up on the blog when it's ready. And you're still here directing at Warner Brothers.
Still here today.
And so my last question
Okay.
is your 5 top picks, either stuff that you worked on or stuff you loved as a kid, features, television shows, because I know that you basically have collected and looked at almost everything. So what would you give as your top 5?
My top 5. Well, I guess I'll probably talk about stuff I worked on. Now, growing up loving animation like all the guys and gals, my peers and those that have come after me. I mean, we all love the Disney stuff and the MGM and Warners. And I mean, I like it all, UPA, all that stuff. But I guess I'll talk about the shows I worked on. They're not necessarily, this one's the best one, this one is, this is just the group of 5. I like working on Metamorphosis, Winds of Change, because it was about Greek mythology, and I'm fascinated with ancient history. But I got a chance to animate and be around a bunch of really great guys to learn from.
Right.
And they shared those experiences, and I learned from those guys. Samurai Jack, that I directed on with Robert. It was just such a great looking show, and really, I just admire Gindi so much because he's so good at what he does, and he's a real good guy. The Sylvester and Tweety Mysteries, because it was a very creative period. It was kind of
It was kind of the flowering of Warner Brothers in that middle 90s period where they were doing all of the Spielberg shows and they were doing the classic characters. And
Exactly. It was kind of a golden period for the people who worked on Sylvester and Tweety. I can't tell you how many people from other shows in that building would come to me and want to get on our show whenever we'd have an opening. And then we didn't have an opening very often. So what's that? That's Winds of Change, Samurai Jack.
That's 3.
That's 3.
2 more.
2 more. Oh man, now it gets tough because man, I have a hard time remembering.
Well,
what goes
stuff
on
you didn't
here.
work on that influenced you, that jazzed you, that made you want to get into the business.
Well, everything. I mean, I love the early H&B stuff. Rough and Ready, Huck, Yogi, Quick Draw, the first season of the Flintstones. I just went nuts over that stuff. I mean, going up to the studio and being able to take all, there was no market to sell those cells and that stuff when they would throw it all out. So just being able to go there and take those cells and have those cells and drawings and things that they'd throw out and knowing, man, I want to do this. It's, you lived your dream, and I don't know many people that have lived their dream. But there's got to be one other show here. Let me dig this memory if I can remember back any farther. Well, that first Batman, which was real cutting edge. I mean, I was grateful.
It's basically sort of been the model and the template for most of the stuff that's come after in the superhero area.
Absolutely, I love that Batman. But let me tell you one last little quick story before we cut this off. I talked with Robert today, and I was telling Robert how much I enjoyed his interview, listening to it. And he reminded me of a story when we were kids, so I think I'll end it with this. This might be kind of funny. When we used to go up to, I was probably the first person to take the cells out of the trash can. And then I got Robert involved. Then we started seeing other kids start showing up.
You started a trend.
I started a trend. Now, at one point, Hanna-Barbera had one of these metal bars put across the trash can with a lock on it. It was a typical dumpster where you lift up the two big lids. And they had a metal bar that went across and they'd lock it. Well, one time Robert and I went up there and the metal bar was unlocked. So I took the metal bar and I carried that metal bar all the way to my house, thinking, well, they'll never be able to lock it again and not
We'll be able to get into the dumpster.
Yeah. Well, that lasted for about a day because I'm sure they just got another one right away after that. But Robert had reminded me of that. And that thing was heavy, and I must have ridden
You
my
were
bike.
balancing it on your shoulder.
Yeah, and I must have ridden my bike about 4 miles.
One hand on the handlebars.
And a knapsack full of cells.
Well, that's a dedicated animation geek. Is
That's it.
what that is.
Thanks, Steve.
And we are done.